computer so that I have it for everybody else. And so what I wanted to talk about really today is religion during the 1800s. Uh, and of course, I tend to think that people think that American religion has been static, that it's the same as it was in 1607, and it's not. It's changed. There's a lot of changes going on in society, especially during the Industrial Revolutions. One of the areas of change was in Christianity. I mean, there was a big focus on religion and health. Today, physicians are very familiar with the placebo effect, right? That you can, if people have a positive attitude, they feel like you could give them a sugar pill and they think that they're getting better. But, and so the placebo effect really occurred a lot in the 1800s. People felt that their spirituality in a lot of ways could heal most of their illnesses. And there was a lot of speculation about the connection between physical and spiritual states. And one of the big proponents of this was Sylvester Graham. He was born in 1774, died around 1851, somewhere around there. He was a big temperance advocate, didn't like alcohol. He was one of those people, and I hate using this in a video, who believed that masturbation led to blindness. In fact, he wrote a book called Lectures to Young Men on Chastity. He said that would also lead to blindness, but it could also lead to diabetes, deafness, jaundice, and your teeth would fall out. And it was just because he felt that the sex drive was destructive to the human body. And so he said that was driven by the stomach. He said that food was transformed into the stomach, and that keeps your spirit nourished. So what you wanted to do to make sure that you control some of your impulses was to have a very bland diet. So he's a vegetarian, and that he believed that people should eat a special kind of bread. He hated bleached white flour. He wanted a bread made from an unbolted wheat flour that was very, very bland. Now, you probably know a lot of this unbolted wheat flour bread now by its more common name of graham crackers. That's the origins of graham crackers. It was designed so that you would eat something non-spicy. So he would say, don't have alcohol, don't have tea, don't have coffee, don't have meat, don't have spices. And so it's a very bland diet, to be sure, to control the urges that would lead you astray. And his ideas influence a lot of people like Bronson Alcott. Bronson Alcott, you may know from Louisa May Alcott and Little Women. He and his family for a while were what they called fruitarians. Sometimes for months on end, they only ate apples. Now you can imagine what that would be like. Well, we're having apple pie, we're having apple fritters, let's have some apple juice. Oh my gosh, you get tired of apples. Alcott actually called his home Fruitlands for a while. Now, Graham also influenced somebody by the name of Ellen White. She had been a member of the Millerites. Now, if you remember the Millerites, they had expected the world to end in 1844. Spoiler, it didn't happen. And she claimed that she had direct visions from God. And God had told her that human health is just as important as the 10 Commandments. And so she helped create the Seventh-day Adventists, which follow a very strict diet and biblical literalism. She founded the Western Reform Institute in Battle Creek, Michigan, which you know for cereals, where most of rich Americans would come there to improve their health. Their chief doctor was a guy by the name of John Harvey Kellogg, right? So you know Kellogg's cornflake and Kellogg's cereal. It's that guy. People like J.C. Penney, Rockefeller, Montgomery Ward all came to take the health cure there. And of course, he's best known for cornflakes. Yet another group called the Christian Scientists. Now, the Christian Scientists concentrated on the relationship between the body and the mind. And they were founded by a lady by the name of Mary Baker Eddy. Christian scientists believed that the mind was more real than the material world, that the material world was just a projection of the mind. And so Mary Baker Eddy was an invalid for the first part of her life, and then she met a mesmerist. I mean, we all know mesmerists, mesmerizing, hypnotizing people, by the name of, and it does sound like a suspicious name, Phineas Quimby, who she claims cured her by using his mental power. And when he died in 1866, she felt this was a great loss to humanity. became convinced that you could actually think your way to good health. And eventually, if you were in the right spiritual mind, you would never die. Uh, she believed that illness was caused by having the wrong frame of mind. And so what she wanted to do was to combine Quimby's mesmerism with Orthodox Christianity. And so she created this book called Science and Health. And in 1879, she founded the Christian Science Church, headquartered in Boston, and later started a college. She believed that that she could live forever, but by the early 20th century, she was in her 80s and she started to become sick. Now, she had a hard time explaining, why am I getting sick? I'm in the right spiritual frame of mind. She came with this idea that her enemies were beaming evil thoughts at her, and she called these evil thoughts malicious animal magnetism. She does die in 1910 because we do know the mortality rate is holding steady at 100%. So why did so many people join the Christian Science Church? That's a good question. Why? I mean, it's a very popular church for a long time, the Christian Science Church. Well, because if you go back to the 1880s, conventional medicine was so primitive. I mean, there were still people who were bleeding people. They still believed in the four humors, a lot of them did. And you were just as likely to get better staying at home and having a positive attitude than going to the hospital. The hospital was a place that you could easily get an illness and die. And religion at this time was going to be less doctrinal and more sentimental in the Victorian age than it was Puritan days. No longer was, we went back to the sinners in the hands of the angry God speech, but now Jesus is seen as a loving friend and a companion. So Victorian Protestantism was much more sentimental. It was more ornate. And in a lot of ways, it was more feminized. I don't mean feminized in terms of feminism today, but had a greater influence by women. And one of the famous women at this time was Elizabeth Stuart Phelps, who wrote a book called The Gates Ajar. It described the fortunes of a family whose son was killed in the Civil War. And they're all sad. Their son's dead, and they're mourning. And then their aunt comes to visit them and said, "Look, why are you so sad?" They said, "Well, our son's dead." And they said, "Well, don't be sad, because he's now in heaven with Jesus, and you will see him someday." Well, the aunt gets terminal cancer. Now, she doesn't become sad. She doesn't pity herself. She becomes cheery because she's going to heaven. And so it's an enormously popular book. And she writes a whole bunch of sequels to the book. So yeah, we've always had sequels. And they are set in heaven, which oddly enough looks like middle-class America, because that's where she's writing from. She'll later write a biography of Jesus called The Story of Jesus Christ. And her thesis in the book is, look, Jesus is the only man who's ever lived who had no earthly father. Joseph was his only stepfather. So since his only earthly contact was Mary, it's no wonder that Jesus would have a special understanding of women. Now, another book written at this time was Charles Sheldon. He wrote a book about Jesus called In His Steps. This is going to be famous. It's a story. It tells the story of a preacher who passed a man who was begging for money. The preacher did not give him any money because he was in a hurry. But when he was returning home, he saw the man had died. And he thought, that man's dead. I passed him. And of course, he asked the question, what would Jesus do? And that's where that phrase, WWJD, comes from. It was coined from this book. And what happens here is that it spreads throughout the town. So there's a sports writer who goes to a boxing event, and he sees this bloody spectacle he's covering, and he goes, would Jesus cover this? No, so I will not do this. A man who's drinking a lot goes, would Jesus do this? No, I would not do this. So they all keep asking themselves, what would Jesus do, and become better individuals within their community. This was the most popular book in the United States until Gone with the Wind. Now, another book at the time was Ben-Hur. We've all seen the movie with Charlton Heston. I own the movie, and the great part is I always like when Ben-Hur comes back and sees his friend, and his friend's surprised that it's Ben-Hur, that somehow Ben-Hur survived being in the galleys. But it was a book written by Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace, a Civil War general who also was the governor of Mexico that helped hunt down Billy the Kid. And it's really a very swashbuckling action adventure tale is really what it is. What happens at key points in the story, of course, is that Ben-Hur, that Jesus shows up to help Ben-Hur, right? He shows up at one point, gives Ben-Hur water while he's being marched to the galleys. He's up there giving the Sermon on the Mount. And then at the end, Ben-Hur becomes a Christian. But it's a real action packed. If you watch the movie and there's the war scene in the galleries, there's the chariot races. It's a very popular book. And we'll come back to this. This is an example of what we call muscular Christianity. Now, as Protestants got more money, they began building grander churches that early Puritans would have hated. Puritans would hate most churches today. They wanted churches that were, 4 walls, and that's about it. Because anything else like organs or windows or anything like that would smack of what they called the papal influence. And these new Protestant churches have a much more Gothic influences. And revivalist preachers began emphasizing free will conversion and not predestination. Remember, the Puritans always threw out the idea of predestination. And now they're saying, no, you can actually get your way to heaven by choosing to do the right things. Well, of course, this is going to cause some problems throughout America in terms of different points of view. But let's talk about some of these revivalist preachers. One of them was Dwight Moody, probably the most famous. He worked to save souls in the Chicago slums. At first, he always brought bread to feed the hungry. But then he realized that the poor were too busy eating to listen to the sermon. So he stopped because he said it was more important to save souls than lives. And so he actually wrote a book on how to run the ideal prayer meeting. He said, have some lively music, have an open air. It should be a well-lit room. It should be a cheerful room. And so these revivalist preachers start in American Protestantism, begin to divide between liberal and evangelical branches. And one of the causes of this divide was Darwinism, right? The idea, he wrote his book, the Evolution of the Species, or the Origin of the Species, and talked about evolution. And what the divide here is that if what Darwin said was true, then the biblical account of Genesis could not be true. Because according to the Bible, God created life just as it is today. But Darwin said they evolved from simpler forms. And this is along the same line as the geologist Charles Lyell, who estimated the Earth to be millions of years old. And that didn't fit with biblical versions of the Earth being a few thousand years old. So the problem is that if you try to reconcile the two ideas, then you're having a problem of trying to take the Bible account literally or metaphorically. And if you're trying to pick which parts are literal and which one are metaphorical, then you're setting yourself up to be the judge of which parts of the Bible are true and which are not. And there were one group of Protestants who said, no, we are not going to do that. We're going to believe in the Bible as absolutely infallible in all things. And when it becomes between the word of man or the Bible, they're going to side with the Bible. The other side said, look, well, the evidence is so overwhelming, it must be true. Surely God would not send us all this evidence to trick us. We need to find ways to adopt our faith to these new realities. And still, when we look at Darwinism, it's not really the biggest thing that leads to a lot of this divide. It's historically critical Bible study. When historians start looking at the Bible, they go, look, the Bible seems to be filled with contradictions. It seems to be written in different styles. It seems to be written at different times and places. It seems to have similarities with other religions. So some began saying, well, the Bible's really a compilation of many different Jewish stories from different times rather than God's word laid down all once and for all. So you're going to end up really with two groups. The fundamentalists, which we still hear that term today, who said you should stick to the Bible no matter what the evidence says. Bible's not just the word, it's not just the word of man, but it's the word of God. And then you had the liberal parts of the Protestant church who said that you should adapt to the facts at hand. Well, liberal Protestants will split even further over what they call the social gospel movement. Um, Now, one of the people that doesn't like the social gospel, and we're going to talk about what that means, was Henry Ward Beecher. He was the son of Lyman Beecher. He was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was probably the most famous preacher of the time. Um, and so uh, he was not a biblical literalist, but he believed in evolution, but he was also in favor of temperance. This is a bit of controversy with Christians because one of Jesus's first miracles was turning water into wine. Well, you've got a lot of people in the United States in the fundamentalist group that are temperance people. They want to abolish alcohol. And so how do you reconcile those? So some will say, well, it really wasn't wine, it was grape juice. Beecher, being the temperance guy and a fundamentalist, said, look, let's look at the evidence. The evidence that it was wine. And that was okay back then because it was in a pre-industrial society. And he said that if Jesus was here today, he would support temperance because of mechanization. Now, Beecher also accepted social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism was developed by William Graham Sumner and Herbert Spencer. And like any other scientific idea, when we talked earlier about Newton laws, and that led off to the deists, people are going to take Darwinism and say, well, it must apply this idea of survival of the fittest, which was not something that Darwin said, but Spencer and Sumner said, that if adaptation for the most superior species wins out, then that must also be true for society. So if somebody was poor, it was because they deserved it, and they must be lazy, because clearly they would say there's plenty of food and work here. And if you were rich, then obviously you were accepted as this. And by the way, this idea of social Darwinism will be used by Christians by saying, well, clearly we're the most superior religion because we've spread faster than anybody else. So people will take an idea and move it and turn it to a way that will support them. Now, on the other side of the social gospel, you had Washington Gladden. He's probably the best known social gospel preacher. He says, don't think in terms of individual salvation. Think in terms of the collective welfare of society. He and the other members of the social gospel were aware of the business cycles, and that sometimes the economy was down and it was impossible to find work. And some people cannot find work, not because they are sinners, but because they can't find jobs. I mean, you're talking at a time period when, like in 1893, you have a depression, or what they call a panic, where you have unemployment hitting 33 to 40%. Very difficult. And they point out, they said, look, times have changed. When you had problems back in colonial days, you could still feed yourself because most people were farmers. Now that so many people live in the city, when the economy collapses, then that means people can't feed themselves. And that was no longer possible, and people would go hungry, and we had a responsibility to do that. Now, this is going to be sort of interesting that you'll like. Washington Gladden said, look, the idea of profit and wages as the sole motivator of an individual is unchristian. And he and other Christians denounced capitalism, said that we must become socialist, because they argue that Jesus was a socialist, because he was a tradesman, right? A tradesman would be a common worker. That would be what socialism would appeal to. And he preached the collective good. So far as you can see how people will take Jesus and they'll pick what they want, that, Jesus has a special relationship with women because he only had an earthly mother. Here, Jesus is the tradesman, the carpenter, and collects the collective good. So therefore he must be a socialist. And so they said that the United States was a fallen nation. Okay, do we hear this today, right? That we've lost our moral way. They're saying this in 1890s and the 1880s. And they said, we have to have a massive revival so we can all live a Christ-like life. So we still see that split today, right? We still use the term fundamentals, the fundamentalists, because actually they published a book called The Fundamentals, and it spelled out the litmus test of what Christians needed to believe, that inerrancy of the scripture, the virgin birth was real, the resurrection was real, the reality of miracles. these are the fundamental things you say you have to believe as a Christian. So that's where we get the term fundamentalist. Well, what about other groups? How about the American Catholics? Now, Catholics in the United States early on were the Irish, right? They had, in the 1840s, escaped from the potato famine. In the 1880s, we're seeing Catholics coming from Southern Europe. So they're becoming more ethnically diverse. And Catholics in New York argued with the school board, right? Because here's what people don't understand. They especially students of mine, they all think that everybody uses the King James Version of the Bible. They don't. And so Catholics will say, look, we don't like what you're teaching in the schools. We're going to have to find another way. And most Protestants did not see Catholics as Christian. In fact, they saw them as the antithesis of Christianity. And I hear that today. There was somebody who was fairly well known that I knew in the city that was very religious, lived the life, but told me often Catholics are not Christians, and they were friends with a lot of Catholics and said they won't be going with, they're not Christians. I always thought that was interesting. I had a lot of discussions. And of course, there was always this anti-Catholic propaganda in the United States, right? And we know that when we get way in advance, that people did not want John F. Kennedy because he was a Catholic. A lot of that's gone to the wayside. In fact, the majority of the Supreme Court is Catholic today. But there was a lot of propaganda. Thomas Nast cartoons were often anti-Catholic. One of the most famous books that was out there was a book by somebody named Maria Monk. It was called Awful Disclosures. It was a bestseller. In the book, she says that priests raped nuns, and if they got pregnant, the nuns got pregnant, they would baptize the infant and then strangle the child and bury it in the basement. Now, she was exposed as a fraud, but the book remained a bestseller for a long time. And so there was a lot of this sort of anti-Catholic feeling. And if you go back and read or look at some of Thomas Nast cartoons, crocodiles were wearing cardinal and papal hats as their noses. Well, by 1884, Catholics have said, look, we've had enough of public schools. So they're going to begin their own series of private schools. And so they're going to spend in the 20th century a lot of money and energy building a parallel education system. And I think you're seeing that much more in the last 30 years with evangelicals doing a lot of the same thing. So in each parish, the first thing was built was a school, then the church. Then you would build your church to go on after you had your school and you're educating your young. Now, when we started getting Catholics in from Southern Europe in the 1880s, then they were trying to bring Catholics together, right? Because you had Irish Catholics, you had Italian Catholics, you had German Catholics, and they didn't want them to splinter, but eventually they do. And as we know, ethnic groups tended to live next to each other. There were Irish neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, and often Catholic neighborhoods that were all Irish, or Italian neighborhoods that were Catholic and all Italian. In fact, you could still go to Boston and see Little Italy. One of the more famous books that's fairly accurate was about Catholicism at the time was the Madonna of 115th Street, written by Robert Orsi. And the book describes Harlem, which has undergone numerous changes over the century by different groups. But this describes Harlem in the late 1800s. And the neighborhood would celebrate the Madonna by marching a statue through the streets. The women would be carried with their tongues dragging on the ground as a sign of penance. Well, as you can imagine, these kind of rituals often shocked mainstream Protestants. And so anti-Catholic feelings will continue for a long time. So now let's take a shift and talk about gender roles, men and women in the 1800s. Today we often try to talk about, men and women, they have a lot of things in common. Back then, it was the differences. And by the way, we're doing a play about that right now called A Doll's House, which really stresses the differences of this. And so if you come see the play, you'll see how this is supposed to work in this 1800s Victorian age. Men were supposed to be intellectual. They were supposed to be rational, muscular. They should work hard in the outside world. Women, they were delicate, intuitive, and religious. They should stay at home and create the moral, upright home and family. That's the ideal, but most women were too poor not to work. Doctors believed that education for women would make them hysterical, and that if they were pregnant when they were getting educated, they would transfer that insanity to their baby through the umbilical cord. And they said that granting women political rights would make them, quote unquote, mannish. Um, uh, and this was mainly in the city. We saw that in the farm areas, there was a clear line who should perform what roles, but in the cities are a little bit different. Doctors in this time period had been very interested in gender roles in the 1880s and 1890s. And they would stress the differences. Like I said, women are supposed to, according to the doctors, were gentle, more emotional, less intellectual, but they were morally superior to men. So I think we can start seeing this double standard popping up that we talk about today. Women were supposed to be the angel of the household. They were to be the moral example to men in society. They were to nurture and be the moral guardian for the next generation, because they would say, look, who created the great men? Great mothers. And of course, they said women should never get too excited because they become hysterical and they pass on that insanity to the children. And I know that we think that's just, why would people think that? There are going to be thoughts today that we think are just, hey, well, this makes sense to us, that maybe in 100 years they're going to go, why did they think that? We don't know. But they believe that. In cities, for the first time, women become consumers, right? Because you'll be out shopping. And we're starting to see the creation of mass market department stores. There's actually a book called The Wide, Wide World, published in 1874. I can't remember who. And it's written about a woman who talks about her experiences shopping for a Bible, because this is different, right? I mean, you think, well, you just go out and get a Bible, but for these people, they're going, there are so many different types. There's gold inlay, there's big, there's small, there's leather bound, there's all these different types of Bibles. And it talks about her experience, her religious experience, trying to pick out a particular Bible. Now, women who did work did mainly domestic work. There was so much housework to do because we had no machines. The housework was laborious. It was time consuming. Imagine having to clean a rug, right? Getting out there and beating a rug for a long time, doing laundry. Laundry today is, I do laundry, you just go throw it in the laundry machine and go, and move on out. But women who did work usually worked as nurses. They worked in the garment industry, and we'll come back to one of the great tragedies of that, or they acted as salespersons and secretaries. Now, men were considered tough, competitive, cerebral, but not as moral. Men had to be competitive. They had to be ruthless in this economic sphere. Of course, like I said, this is the age of social Darwinism, right? And men had to get out there and fight in this dog-eat-dog world. So men would go into this ruthless world every day. And so they could be ruthless. They could be less moral. See, double standard. But then they would come home to their wives, who would be there to recharge their spiritual batteries. Now, the church was concerned about this because they felt that Christianity was becoming too feminine. And I know, Lori, you're at church. Think about what are the percentages of women and men at your church. And here, more women than men went to church. And so the idea was, okay, we've got to get men back into church. It can't be seen just as a woman's thing. So one of the interesting trends in the late 1800s was this idea of muscular Christianity. This idea that, look, Jesus is not some wimpy feminine guy. He's a tough guy. After all, he's a carpenter, right? He's got to work with his hands. That's tough work. He's a muscular guy. And this was one of the ideas behind the YMCA. It was to show that men, you could be Christian and manly. And the YMCA helped invent sports like basketball and volleyball. And what they would do is they would go to colleges and they would try to recruit the football quarterback, the big tough guy, to join the YMCA so that he could be the role model of the athletic Christian male. And he could speak out for muscular Christianity. And so today, I'm going to have to update this. I often think of Tim Tebow, right? The Heisman Trophy winning quarterback who did that, who was sort of that kind of a person. One other such convert at the time was a guy by the name of Amos Alonzo Stagg. He was credited in football for inventing the forward pass and actually numbering jerseys. He went to Yale Divinity School and after college became a football coach in Chicago in an effort to Christianize football, to show those people that, yes, you can be a tough guy, but you could still love Jesus and be a core. Another convert was a baseball player by the name of Billy Sunday. You can actually get his card. We'll talk about more about him later and what he does in the off season. But probably the best example of muscular Christianity at the time is going to be Teddy Roosevelt. You know, Teddy Roosevelt was a sickly child, but out of sheer force of will, he overcame all his illnesses and grew up to be the epitome of the tough guy. Christian, but he was a boxer, he was a hunter, you know, he was the bull moose. I mean, we're going to talk about him later getting shot in an assassination attempt and still giving a speech. Women reformers argued that, say, okay, we're different than men. We should use our differences to change society. And probably one of the biggest group was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was the first large-scale women's political movement. They wanted to abolish alcohol. Another group was what they called the White Life, that was led by women, who said that everybody should refrain from having sex except in cases where reproduction was necessary. And so to lead the White Life, you could join a group called the Society of the White Cross. Young boys could join the Knights of Silver Crown to prepare them for celibacy. And one of this group was led by Frances Willard. Now, to understand a lot of this idea about sex and only having sex when it was necessary for reproduction, you need to realize for women, the idea of sex was a dangerous idea, right? The number one cause of death for women at the time was, of course, childbirth. And therefore, any time that you had sex with your husband, you were risking your life. And of course, they're going to tie sex in with alcohol and said that alcohol was bad because it led to what they called rape within the marriage and what they called mentally deficient children. So they felt that banishing alcohol would solve the problem. And again, like I said, people may think that's strange, but at the time, for women, pregnancy was incredibly dangerous. Now, another reformer, one of my favorites, and I'd like to find a souvenir. I know you probably on eBay, is Carrie Nation. She was from Kansas and she hated alcohol, really hated alcohol. So she would pray outside a saloon, hoping that she could get the saloon to shut down. You know, there'd be a long prayer there. And then if the saloon didn't shut down, then what her plan was to go in there and just knock it down, knock down the bar. And so it was tough to stop her because she would charge you with an axe and begin destroying the place. Now, she was about like 5'2" and weighed over 200 pounds. And it's a muscular 200 pounds. And so stopping her was very difficult to do. And in a bit of marketing, what she would do is she would sell miniature versions of her axe and sometimes autograph them. So like I'd like to find one of those, one of the Carrie Nation axe, and autograph them. And she went to prison several times, obviously. But what she would do is before she did this, she would alert the media when she was about to go in and bust up a saloon. And this meant she got a lot of media coverage. She wanted to be seen as a, what's the word I'm looking for? A martyr for the cause, right? A prisoner of conscience is a good way to say that. Now, moving that over, now let's get to women's suffrage, right? Getting women the right to vote. The 15th Amendment gave African-American men the right to vote, but not women. And women were very upset about this, but even Frederick Douglass said, look, we've got to take what we can get, we'll move on and come back to women. Some of the early leaders were, of course, Susan B. Anthony, which we all know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we all know that. They used what they call the purity argument. They said, look, politics is corrupt. It's terrible. It's a mess. Same thing we hear today. But since women are morally superior, if they were given the vote, their their purity would clean up politics. And so they formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. Women fared well out west. In fact, this is a thesis by Frederick Jackson Turner, said that democracy would continue to expand. It moved out west. And every state, up until I think the 19th Amendment, that had women the right to vote were west of the Mississippi. Wyoming being the first state giving the women territory and state to give women the right to vote in 1869, then Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. So yeah, it was very difficult for women to get the vote. And it was also difficult to get them educated. Again, they felt that if you educated women that too much, they'd become mentally and emotionally unhinged. Now, the first college for women was created by Matthew Vassar, Vassar College, you've heard of it. He was a brewer. And so he goes, look, I'm open to college for women, but the courses weren't going to be too rigorous. And we're going to have you closely supervised because they don't want to overstimulate women's mind because that would be dangerous. Probably another trailblazer was Ellen Richards. She was the first woman to graduate from MIT. She was a pioneer for women in science at a time when that idea was unheard of. In fact, she invented the term domestic science. She said a good housewife needs to be a good scientist. But she didn't upset people because what she would do is she would dress, or she did a lot of the janitorial work at MIT. So people say, well, she's in her typical role, that's fine, even though she was still taking classes. Now, at the other end of the spectrum is, we all know this person, Lizzie Borden, out of Fall River, Massachusetts. As you know, Lizzie Borden, her mother and father were murdered, right? Everybody knows the rhyme, right? Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her that one, right? And she was a Sunday school teacher. Now, the evidence indicates that, yes, Lizzie Borden killed her parents. She had no alibi. There were no other suspect that you could find. And so she was found not guilty. And when you say, well, how can they find her not guilty? Because the jury was all men, and they believed that there's just no way a woman could do that kind of crime. It's not in their nature. And so they found her not guilty, even though, yeah, she probably killed her parents and no one was ever convicted of the crime. I don't know if the house is still standing. I think I was going to try to go by there and see if it was.
The house is still standing.
Okay, well, the house is still standing. I knew I was in that area and I thought about going and I'd like to go see it. I don't know why. My sister calls me a necro tourist, and I go see where people died, like presidents and stuff. So thanks for that, Jeff. I'll make sure I go see it the next time in the Boston area. And then we're going to see some younger women coming along at the tail end of this who are going to reject the notions of Victorian women. One of those is going to be Jane Addams, who we'll talk about later with Hull House in terms of sociology and helping neighborhoods and using scientific data to do demographic works. And then, of course, another person is Margaret Sanger, who's going to be one of the first proponents of birth control. Her problem is she had to overcome Comstock laws. The Comstock laws said that no sex information could be sent to the U.S. mail, and she gets arrested several times. So again, vast differences between men and women at this time period, and even religion. Religion is something that continues to, if you think it's static, it's not static, right? It's been adapting to times, and it's probably one of the reasons that people think that religion thrives in the United States is that it's almost a free market thing, that religion knows what is the people wanting, and then they adapt to that and they attract new followers. So I think that's an interesting thought. And of course, we still debate over the differences between men and women. We talk about men and women's roles. We talk about gender politics still today. So